My name is Juliana, and for my entire life, I've lived in the shadow of beautiful, dead things. As a fine art restorer, I spend my days breathing life back into forgotten canvases, coaxing brilliance from the decay of centuries. My work is quiet, meticulous, and requires a reverence for the past. My stepfather, Arthur Morrow, possessed no such reverence. He didn't love art. He loved owning it. His world was one of acquisitions, of value measured in auction prices and insurance premiums. He saw my career as a quaint, dusty hobby, like knitting or collecting stamps. It was something a woman of no real ambition did to pass the time. He would pat my head at family gatherings, a gesture thick with condescension, and say to his guests, loud enough for me to hear, Juliana likes to play with her little paint pots. A delicate pastime for a delicate girl. Then he would turn his attention to my stepsister, Philippa. Philippa was his masterpiece, blonde, beautiful, and possessing an effortless charm that made people want to give her the world. And Arthur was more than happy to oblige. He was the sun, and she was the planet he orbited, showering her with everything she could ever want. His pride and joy, besides Philippa, was his collection. Housed in a climate-controlled museum-grade gallery attached to his sprawling granite mansion, it was a breathtaking assembly of Renaissance portraiture, supposedly. He called it the Morrow Collection, and it was his legacy, a monument to his taste and wealth that he had publicly and repeatedly promised to Philippa upon his passing. It was to be her inheritance, her future, continued life of gilded ease. I was never mentioned. It was understood that my portion of the family legacy was the occasional condescending pat on the head. The story I'm about to tell you isn't really about the art. It's about value. It's about what we see when we look at a thing, or a person, and what we decide they're worth. For 20 years, Arthur had decided I was worth very little, and then 1 week before his biggest social triumph, a gala at the city's most prestigious museum where his favorite painting would be the star exhibit, he found a use for me. He called me, his voice a low, impatient hum that I knew all too well. It was the voice he used when speaking to staff. He said, Juliana, I need you, the Bronzino. He didn't say which one. He assumed I would know he meant his favorite, the centerpiece of his collection, a haunting portrait of a nobleman with eyes that seemed to hold a universe of sorrow. He didn't call it by its title, Portrait of a Scholar. He called it the Bronzino, as if the artist himself was a brand he had personally acquired. There's a small bit of flaking near the frame on the left side, barely noticeable, but with all the lights at the gala, it might catch the eye. I need you to come and do a touch-up. Make it perfect. A touch-up. The word itself was an insult, a dismissal of my entire profession. You don't touch up a 500-year-old masterpiece, like you're covering a scuff on a wall. The process is painstaking, requiring analysis, custom mixed pigments, and a surgeon's steady hand. But I said yes. I always said yes. It's a hard habit to break, that desperate quiet hope that this time, this one small act of service, will finally earn a sliver of genuine appreciation. It's a fool's hope, but it was all I had. So I packed my kit, my portable microscope, my collection of solvents and pigments, and drove to the house I was never quite welcome in. I was about to find out that my stepfather's entire life, his legacy, and my stepsister's future were all built on a foundation of lies, and I was the only person in the world who could prove it. It wasn't about revenge, not then, it was about the truth. But I would soon learn that sometimes, the truth is the most brutal form of revenge there is. The air in Arthur's private gallery was always cold. It was a stiff, morgue-like chill, designed to preserve the dead, and it smelled of ozone from the high-tech filtration system. It was a stark contrast to my own studio, which was a chaotic mess of turpentine, linseed oil, and old books, warm and smelling of life. I set up my portable easel and my magnifying lamp, the stark white light illuminating the face of the nobleman. Arthur had left me alone, of course. He'd given his order and had no interest in the process, only the result. As I leaned in, my face inches from the canvas, I could see the problem immediately. It wasn't just flaking, it was a delicate network of cracklu, the fine web of cracks that forms in old oil paint. One tiny piece of varnish, no bigger than a grain of sand, had lifted. This was my world. This was where I was not a delicate girl, but an expert. I felt the familiar calm settle over me as I began my work, a ritual I'd performed 1,000 times. I first examined the area under my digital microscope, documenting the existing state of the paint layers. It's a non-negotiable step in conservation. You have to know precisely what you're dealing with before you touch a single thing. I adjusted the magnification, zooming deep into the microscopic canyons of the cracklu. I was looking at the structure of the paint, the way the ancient pigments were ground, the layers of varnish applied over centuries, and then I saw it. It was almost nothing, a whisper. Tucked deep inside a crack in the dark umber background, almost completely obscured by the yellowed patina of the old varnish, was a mark that did not belong. It wasn't a brushstroke, it was writing. My heart began to beat a little faster. This was not uncommon. Sometimes artists hid monograms or dates in the shadows, but this was different. The script was modern, fluid, and impossibly faint. I cleaned the area with a specialist solvent on the tip of a fine bristled brush, a process that temporarily increases the transparency of the old varnish. I held my breath, peering through the eyepiece of the microscope. The letters sharpened into focus. Ilmir, and below it, a flourish that I recognized instantly from textbooks and documentaries. Dihori. My blood ran cold. It felt like the entire 2-ton granite mansion had just dropped on my chest. Ilmir Dihori. The name echoed in my mind, a legend in the art world, but for all the wrong reasons. He wasn't a Renaissance master. He was, perhaps, the most prolific and brilliant art forger of the 20th century. His Modiglianis, his Picassos, his Matisses, they had fooled experts, museums, and wealthy collectors for decades. He was a ghost who painted in the style of giants, a con man with the soul of an artist, and his signature, his real signature, was hidden deep within the layers of my stepfather's priceless, 16th century bronze. I pulled back from the microscope, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists. I looked around the silent, cold gallery, at the dozen other paintings hanging on the walls, the Titian, the Tintoretto, the Raphael, all of them paragons of the High Renaissance, bought by Arthur over decades from prestigious dealers and shadowy private sales, all of them forming the bedrock of his social standing, his identity as a man of supreme taste, a collection worth on paper upwards of $100 million, and it was all a lie, a grand, spectacular, breathtaking fraud. The entire collection was a house of cards, and I, the quiet restorer, the girl with the delicate pastime, had just found the loose brick in the foundation. I was the only one who knew, the only one who could prove it. In that moment, staring at the face of a nobleman who had never existed, painted by a master who was actually a Hungarian charlatan, a cold, hard thought formed in my mind, clear as a diamond. He deserves this. The first thing I did was lie. I meticulously completed the touch-up, applying a microscopic bead of conservation-grade adhesive to secure the flaking varnish, then in painting the tiny loss with a stable pigment that was fully reversible. I documented my work with the precision of a crime scene investigator, my hands moving with an automated calm while my mind screamed. I was covering my tracks. The evidence of my discovery was now hidden again, safe beneath the layer of my own professional, invisible repair. I packed up my kit, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird. Every painting I looked at now seemed to be mocking me, their subjects smirking from behind their gilded frames. The sorrowful nobleman now looked like he was in on the joke. Arthur found me as I was about to leave. He didn't ask how it went, or what was required. He just glanced at the spot from 10 feet away, nodded once, and said, "Good. It's perfect. Philippa will be so pleased the collection is looking its best." He said Philippa, not himself, as if this grand gesture for the museum was all for her benefit, another jewel to lay at her feet. Then he did something that felt like a splash of icy water to the face. He reached into his wallet, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills, and tried to press them into my hand. "For your time, Juliana," he said, his voice laced with the bored generosity of a man tipping a parking attendant. I recoiled as if the bills were on fire. My hands, which had just been steady enough to work on a microscopic level, were now trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. All my life, I had craved a single word of genuine respect from this man. I had wanted him to see my skill, my passion, my knowledge, and here he was, trying to pay me off like a handyman for fixing a leaky faucet. The $200 was more insulting than if he'd offered me nothing at all. It was the price he put on my expertise. It was the value he assigned to me. I pushed his hand away. "That won't be necessary, Arthur," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Consider it a family favor." He looked momentarily surprised, then shrugged, pocketing the money. "Suit yourself. Just see that you're not late for the gala. Philippa wants the whole family there to support her." To support her, as if she were the one who had curated the collection, or whose reputation was on the line. I walked out of that house, and into the crisp autumn air, and the dam of 2 decades of quiet resentment didn't just break, it evaporated. It was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp, and utterly clear. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about justice. But as I drove away, the line between the two started to feel vanishingly thin. Back in my studio, the chaos felt comforting. It was real. The smell of turpentine was the smell of my own work, my own life, built far away from the sterile lies of Arthur's gallery. I sat on my stool, surrounded by canvases in various states of repair, a 19th century landscape, with a tear in it, a modernist abstract, with a fading color palette, real art, with real problems, made by real people. I couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's face, the casual way he'd offered me cash, the utter blindness to who I was, and the memories started to flood in, not as a trickle, but as a tidal wave. I remembered being 10 years old, just after my mother had died, and Arthur had entered our lives, sweeping my grieving self and my mother's estate into his portfolio. I had spent a whole weekend on a watercolor, a little landscape of the lake behind our old house. I'd been so proud of it. I ran to show it to him, my heart thumping with a child's desperate need for praise. He was on the phone, waving me away impatiently. When he finally hung up, he took the painting from my hands, glanced at it for less than a second, and said, "How nice, dear." Just then Philippa, who was 12, skipped into the room, holding a hideous clay ashtray she'd made at school. It was lopsided, and painted a garish shade of green. Arthur's face lit up as if he were seeing the sun for the first time. "Philippa, my darling, that is magnificent. We'll put it right here, on the main mantelpiece for everyone to see." And he did. My watercolor was left on the hall table, where it was eventually covered by mail, and then thrown away. He never saw me, he only saw her. Then came the memory of my graduation, from one of the best conservation programs in the country. I'd graduated with top honors. My friends' families were all there, cheering, taking pictures, bursting with pride. My seat in the family section was empty. Arthur and Philippa were in Aspen, a long-planned skiing trip that couldn't possibly be moved. A week later, a card arrived. Inside was a check for $5,000. The note, scrawled in Arthur's arrogant hand, read, "Congratulations. A tough industry for a hobbyist, but I'm sure you'll find your way. Use this to get started." It wasn't a gift, it was a severance package, a dismissal of my hard-earned degree. As a flight of fancy, he was willing to humor with a small investment. I tore up the check. The insult of his money was worse than the insult of his absence. The most recent memory was the sharpest, the one that still felt like an open wound. It was a formal dinner at his house, just a few months ago. He was entertaining a potential business partner. I'd been invited at the last minute, a transparent attempt to present the image of a happy blended family. The caterers he'd hired were serving a complex, multi-course meal, centered around a duck confit with a sour cherry reduction, that he'd boasted about for weeks. Midway through the service, one of the servers dropped a tray of glasses. They were suddenly short-staffed. Without even thinking, Arthur turned to me, right in front of his guest, and said, "Juliana, be a dear and give them a hand in the kitchen, would you? You're so good at practical things." He didn't ask Philippa, who was sitting there describing her latest shopping spree in Milan. He asked me, the restorer, the hobbyist, the help. I spent the next hour in a sweltering kitchen, washing dishes and helping plate desserts, while the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted in from the dining room. Philippa later came in, not to help, but to complain that her wine glass was empty. She didn't even seem to register the absurdity of the situation. I was just Juliana, doing practical things. I sat there in my studio, the hum of the dehumidifier the only sound, and I felt the cumulative weight of all those moments, all those dismissals, all those tiny cuts that had bled me dry of any hope for his approval. And then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur. No greeting, no pleasantries, just 5 words. "Is it done? Don't be slow." I stared at the message, at the cold, commanding tone. He was referring to the final report for the touch-up, the paperwork the museum's registrar would need. He wasn't asking, he was ordering, and something inside me snapped. It was a clean, quiet break. The years of trying, of hoping, of swallowing my pride, it was all over. I looked at my hands, stained with pigment and solvent. These hands could restore the past, but they could also expose it. These hands held his entire world. A cold resolve settled in my bones, a feeling so powerful it was almost peaceful. It wasn't about revenge, but then as I picked up my phone to make a call, I had to admit to myself, maybe it was. Maybe it was about revenge and justice. And maybe, after all this time, I was finally entitled to both. I called the one person I knew would understand the beautiful, terrible intricacies of what I'd just discovered. Leo. Leo was a fellow traveler in the often pretentious world of art conservation. He was a brilliant textile specialist who worked for a smaller academic museum, and he possessed a healthy cynicism for the billionaire collectors who treated art like stock certificates. He was my best friend, my confidant, and my voice of reason. "Leo," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to buy you a drink, a very, very strong one. We met at our usual spot, a dive bar with sticky floors and cheap whiskey that was worlds away from Arthur's polished universe. I laid it all out for him, the call, the touch-up, the gallery, the microscope, and the faint, damning signature of Elmer Dahori. Leo listened, his eyes wide, occasionally letting out a low whistle. When I finished, he just stared at me for a full minute, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Jules," he finally said, his voice a mix of awe and horror. "A Dahori, posing as a Bronzino. That's audacious. That's a masterpiece of a forger." Dahori usually stuck to the moderns, to fake a Renaissance master, the technical skill involved. It's insane. "It's not just one, Leo," I said, leaning forward. After I found the signature, I started looking, really looking. The craquelure on the Titian, it's too uniform, it looks chemically induced, not natural. The underdrawing on the Raphael, what I could glimpse at the edges, it has the hesitant quality of a copyist, not the confidence of a master. And the pigments. Arthur loves vibrant colors. Renaissance blues were made from lapis lazuli, notoriously expensive and difficult to work with. His blues are too bright, too stable. They look like French ultramarine, which wasn't invented until the 1820s. Leo's jaw dropped. "The entire collection? You think the whole thing is fake?" "I don't think it," I said, a grim certainty settling over me. "I know it. My stepfather, the great connoisseur, has $100 million collection of 20th century fakes." "My God," he breathed. "What are you going to do? Are you going to tell him?" I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Tell him, Leo, you know what he's like. He would crush me. He'd hire a team of lawyers to paint me as a bitter, jealous, incompetent wannabe. He'd say I damaged the painting and was trying to cover my tracks. He would leak stories to the press, ruin my reputation, and bury the truth so deep it would never see the light of day. He built his entire identity on being the man who owns these paintings. He would rather burn the world down than admit he was a fool." "So you're going to let him get away with it?" Leo asked, his brow furrowed. "Let him swan around at this gala, being praised for his discerning eye?" "No," I said, the plan starting to take shape in my mind, a dangerous and beautiful architecture. "I'm not going to let him get away with it. But I'm not going to tell him. I'm going to prove it. I need evidence, hard scientific evidence that no lawyer can dispute. Microscopic photos, pigment analysis, infrared scans of the underdrawings. I need to get back into that gallery." "How?" Leo asked, practical as ever. "He'll have the place locked down tighter than Fort Knox before the gala." This was the weak point in my plan. I couldn't just waltz in. I needed a way in, a plausible reason to be there, alone, with my equipment. And then a face surfaced in my memory. Marcus, Arthur's long-serving butler and house manager. Marcus was a quiet, dignified man who had been with the family since before my mother passed away. He was always in the background, a silent observer with sad, knowing eyes. He had seen everything: Arthur's rages, his dismissiveness, Philippa's casual cruelty. He'd always been kind to me, in small, subtle ways: a warm cup of tea when I was left waiting for hours, a quiet, sympathetic glance when Arthur made a particularly cutting remark. He was loyal to the household, but I always sensed his loyalty was to the memory of my mother, not to Arthur. He was my only chance. It was a huge risk. I was asking him to betray the man who signed his paychecks, but I had to try. I found his number in my old contacts and sent him a carefully worded text message. I didn't mention my discovery. Instead, I appealed to his sense of order and my own professionalism. "Marcus, it's Juliana. I am so sorry to bother you, but in my haste to finish the restoration work, I believe I may have left a small case of highly specialized solvents in the gallery. They're temperature sensitive, and I need them for a client tomorrow. Would there be any possibility of me slipping in late tonight to retrieve them? I would be in and out in 10 minutes. I know security is tight before the gala." I waited, my stomach in knots. For an hour there was nothing. I was sure he'd ignored me, or worse, shown the message to Arthur. Then my phone pinged, a simple reply: "The east service door will be unlocked at 11 p.m. You will have 1 hour." My heart leaped. He hadn't just agreed, he'd given me a window, an hour. It was more than I could have hoped for. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, I drove back to the mansion, my real restoration kit in the trunk, not just solvents, but my high-resolution camera, my portable XRF spectrometer for pigment analysis, and a small infrared camera. I felt like a spy, my nerves stretched taut. The service door creaked open as promised. Marcus was there, a tall, somber silhouette in the dim hallway. He didn't say a word, just gave me a single decisive nod, and then walked away to stand watch at the end of the hall, his back to me. It was a gesture of trust and plausible deniability. He didn't want to see what I was doing. He didn't want to know. He was just letting the ghost of his former mistress's daughter into the house. I slipped into the cold, silent gallery. The paintings hung like sleeping beasts, their lies dormant in the darkness. I worked with a frantic, focused energy. The next hour was a blur of high-stakes art history. I started with the Bronzino, taking crystal-clear micro-photographs of the Dehari signature. Then I moved to the others. I used the XRF spectrometer on the vibrant blue cape of a supposed Titian Madonna. The reading came back instantly. A strong peak for cobalt, not the lapis lazuli composite of a 16th century Venetian master. It was cobalt blue, a pigment not commercially available until the 19th century. On a supposed Tintoretto, the infrared camera revealed a faint, grid-like underdrawing, the kind a forger would use to transfer a design, not the free-flowing, confident sketch of a genius at work. Painting after painting, the story was the same. Anachronistic materials, forgers' techniques, hidden signature. Wasn't just Dehari, there were traces of other infamous fakers, their subtle tells like fingerprints at a crime scene. Arthur hadn't just bought one forgery, he'd been the perfect mark for decades. His arrogance and his desire to buy history on the cheap, making him a magnet for every high-end charlatan in Europe. My hour was almost up. I had a memory card full of enough evidence to not only destroy Arthur's reputation, but to send shockwaves through the art market. As I packed my gear, my hands were no longer shaking, they were steady. I was no longer the victim, I was the curator of his destruction. I slipped out the service door as silently as I had arrived. Marcus was gone. On the door handle, he had left a single polished cufflink bearing my mother's monogram. It was a message. This was for her. The next morning, I sat in my studio, the evidence laid out on my computer screen like a battle plan. I had the power to expose him, to call the New York Times and have them splash the headline across the front page. But that felt too simple, too crude. It would be a public spectacle, but it wouldn't give me what I truly wanted. It wasn't about his money, or even his reputation in the wider world. It was about taking back something he had held over me for my entire adult life. My mother, after she died, all of her personal effects, her letters, her photographs, her journals, were absorbed into Arthur's possession. Over the years, whenever I had asked for them, he'd put on a mask of paternalistic concern. "Juliana, it's too painful," he'd say, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're too sensitive. It's better to let these things rest. I'm protecting you." But it wasn't protection. It was control. He was holding my own history hostage. Her journals, filled with her thoughts, her dreams, her feelings about him in those early days. They were the one thing I wanted more than anything. They were my last connection to her, and he kept them locked away. My plan crystallized. It wouldn't be a public detonation. It would be a silent surgical strike. I created a new, anonymous email address, routing it through a dozen encrypted servers. Then I composed a message. The recipient was Arthur's private email, the one he used for his most sensitive dealings. The subject line was just 2 words, provenance inquiry. In the body of the email, there was no text, just a single high-resolution attachment. It was the microscopic photograph I had taken of the Bronzino, with a simple red circle drawn around the faint, unmistakable signature of Elmer Dehari. I hit send, and the silent takeover had begun. For a day there was nothing. I imagined him seeing it, his initial flicker of annoyance at the spam turning to confusion, then to dawning horror as he zoomed in on the image. He would have gone to the gallery, his heart pounding, perhaps with a magnifying glass of his own, praying it was a trick of the light, but he would have found nothing. The signature was invisible to the naked eye, hidden beneath the varnish. I myself had so carefully stabilized. He was trapped. Someone, somewhere, knew his secret, but he didn't know who or how. The panic started on the second day. A call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Arthur, his voice tight with forced casualness. "Juliana, just calling to check in. Haven't heard from you. Hope you're well." It was a lie. He never checked in. This was a fishing expedition. He was trying to see if I sounded different, if I knew. An hour later, a text from Philippa. "Hey Jules, Daddy and I were just thinking about you. We're so excited for the gala. Let me know what you're wearing. Maybe we can coordinate." Uxoxo, the cloying sweetness of it was nauseating. She was his scout, sent out to gauge my mood, to see if the family's resident outcast was showing any signs of rebellion. I didn't reply to either of them. My silence was a weapon, a vacuum into which all their anxieties would rush. By the third day, the pressure escalated. A call from my boss, the director of the conservation center where I did freelance work. Juliana, he said, sounding flustered. I just had the strangest call from Arthur Morrow. He was asking if you were all right. Said you seemed under a great deal of stresses lately. He was hinting that maybe you should take some time off. Is everything okay? I felt a surge of cold fury. He was trying to discredit me preemptively, planting the seed that I was unstable, unreliable. If the truth ever came out, he could point to this call and say, "See, the poor girl was having a breakdown." It was a classic, manipulative move, and it was a mistake. It showed me how scared he truly was. "Everything is fine, David," I said, my voice calm and professional. "Arthur is just being Arthur. Thank you for letting me know." The silence was driving him mad. He was a man who controlled everything and everyone around him, and for the first time, he was facing an unknown variable. He was shadowboxing with a ghost, and he had no idea that the ghost was living in a small studio across town, carefully cataloging the evidence of his entire fraudulent life. He thought his enemy was a faceless blackmailer. He hadn't yet realized the enemy was the one person he had never ever seen as a threat. The breaking point came on the fourth day. I was in my studio, carefully cleaning a 17th century Dutch still life, when I heard a commotion outside. A sleek black car had screeched to a halt, and Arthur himself stormed out. He didn't knock. He strode right into my studio, his face a thunderous mask of rage and fear. The sheer violation of him invading my space, my sanctuary, sent a jolt through me, but I didn't let it show. I calmly put down my cotton swab and turned to face him, my expression a carefully constructed wall of neutrality. "Arthur," I said, my voice even, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" He stared at me, his eyes scanning my face, looking for a tell, a flicker of guilt or triumph. He was still trying to play the part of the concerned father. "Juliana, what is going on? You're not answering your phone. Philippa is worried sick." "I'm worried. I've been busy," I replied, gesturing to the painting on my easel. "I have work to do." "Work?" he scoffed, his composure starting to crack. "This is your work, dabbling with these old forgotten things. I'm talking about the gala, the collection, our family's legacy." "Your legacy, Arthur," I corrected him gently, "built on your collection." His eyes narrowed.
Holes.
We were circling the subject. Two fighters in a ring, but he was the only one throwing punches. He switched tactics, moving from feigned concern to bribery. "Listen, Juliana," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye. I know perhaps I've been preoccupied, but you have talent. Real talent. What if we put it to better use? I could set you up, your own gallery. Not a workshop, a real, high-end gallery in the city. You could manage it. We could even feature some pieces from the collection." I almost laughed. It was so transparent, so pathetic. He was offering to buy my silence on a secret he wasn't even sure I knew. He was offering me a gilded cage, a high-paying job to be the official keeper of his lies. "I'm not for sale, Arthur," I said, my voice still quiet. "And I'm not a gallery manager. I'm a restorer. I find the truth hidden under the grime. It's what I do." A flash of pure panic crossed his face. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew that I knew. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving the door to my studio wide open, a trail of his expensive cologne lingering in the air like a poison. The power had shifted. The man who had held all the cards was now playing with an empty hand, and he was terrified. That evening, I sent the second email. This time, the subject line was more direct. The collection. The attachment was a new image, the XRF analysis from the Titian showing the damning peak of 19th century cobalt blue. The body of the email contained just 6 words: "My mother's journals." By Friday, the response was immediate and furious, but not from him. My phone rang, and it was Philippa. She was sobbing, but it was the performative, theatrical sobbing of a spoiled child who has just been told no for the first time. "How could you?" she shrieked into the phone. "How could you do this to us? To Daddy? He is falling apart. You are trying to ruin everything, just because you're jealous. You have always been jealous of me." I listened to her tirade, a storm of accusations and insults. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was ungrateful. I was trying to destroy her future. The collection was her future, she wailed. It had been promised to her. When she finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice as cold and clear as ice. Philippa, your future was built on a lie, $100 million lie that Arthur told himself and then told you. It is not my fault that the foundation is made of sand. Did he ever tell you where the money came from to start that collection? It came from my mother's estate. He sold off her assets, her real assets, to buy his fakes. He built his legacy on top of her grave. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never spoken to her like this before. I had never fought back. You're lying, she whispered, the hysteria gone, replaced by a note of genuine fear. Am I? I replied. Ask him. Ask him about the Bronzino. Ask him about Elmer DeHory. I hung up the phone. The pawn had been sent to do the queen's bidding and had failed. Now the king was alone on the board. He had until Friday, the day of the gala. On Friday morning, a courier arrived at my studio. He handed me a heavy dust-covered cardboard box sealed with yellowing tape. I didn't need to open it. I knew what was inside. My mother's journals. He had caved. A wave of something complex and bittersweet washed over me. I had won. I had what I wanted. I could have stopped there. I could have let him have his gala, let him live with the private knowledge of his fraud, forever looking over his shoulder. But that wouldn't be justice. That would just be a transaction. His humiliation had to be as public as his pride had been. It wasn't about revenge, but now, it absolutely was. I put on a simple, elegant black dress. I didn't need to be flashy. My power wasn't in my clothes. It was in the small encrypted USB drive I slipped into my clutch. I had no invitation to the gala, but I didn't need one. For years, Arthur had treated me like the staff, so tonight, I would use that to my advantage. I went to the service entrance of the museum, a place I knew well from my work, and walked in with a confidence that brooked no argument. No one questioned the woman in the black dress, who looked like she knew exactly where she was going. I emerged into the main hall, a soaring space of marble and glass. It was packed with the city's elite bankers, politicians, socialites. They were all sipping champagne, their faces upturned towards the centerpiece of the evening, which hung on a velvet-draped wall under a halo of spotlights. It was the Bronzino, Arthur's masterpiece, and standing before it holding court was Arthur himself. He was talking to a rapt journalist and a stern-looking woman I recognized as Dr. Alistair Finch, the museum's formidable director. He was in his element, pontificating, gesturing at the canvas, his voice booming with false authority. The genius of Bronzino, he was saying, was his ability to capture not just the likeness, but the very soul of the sitter. Look at the eyes, centuries of sorrow, of wisdom. He saw me then. I was standing at the edge of the small crowd. His voice faltered for a fraction of a second. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of terror. Philippa, standing beside him, looked like she was going to be sick. They both stared at me, waiting for the explosion, the public accusation, the scene. But I wasn't going to give them the drama they expected. I wasn't going to shout. I simply smiled, a small knowing smile, and walked towards him. The crowd parted for me slightly. I didn't stop at the rope. I walked right up to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of turpentine that always clung to my clothes. I leaned in, as if to share a secret. Enjoy the party, Arthur, I whispered, my voice for his ears only. It's the last one you'll ever throw on the back of a lie. I didn't wait for a reply. I pulled back, gave him one last look, and then turned my attention to the museum director. I extended my hand. Dr. Finch, I said, my voice clear and professional. A pleasure to finally meet you in person. My name is Juliana Morrow. I was the conservator who recently performed work on this piece for Mr. Morrow. Dr. Finch, a woman whose entire career was built on academic rigor and a reputation for unimpeachable authenticity, shook my hand, her eyes sharp and questioning. She was a gatekeeper, and she could smell trouble. I have some concerns, I continued, my voice low but firm about the painting's provenance. Some material inconsistencies that I believe the museum, as the exhibiting institution, should be made aware of. I have my full conservation report and a set of analytical documentation with me. I opened my small clutch and let her glimpse the silver USB drive nestled inside. I didn't need to show her the contents. The implication was enough. Her professional, polite expression dissolved, replaced by a mask of cold, hard fury. She wasn't angry at me. She was angry at the possibility of being made a fool of. Her gaze flickered from the USB drive to Arthur's terrified face, and in that instant, I saw his entire world crumble. The power hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated from his side of the room and reappeared on mine. He was no longer the proud benefactor. He was a potential fraud, a source of a major institutional scandal, standing in the middle of his own party. I gave Dr. Finch a small, respectful nod. "I will email you the files in the morning," I said. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the chill spreading from that small group, the professional smiles of the museum staff becoming fixed and brittle. I had not set off a bomb. I had planted a seed of doubt in the most fertile ground imaginable, the mind of a scrupulous academic, whose reputation was now on the line. Arthur's destruction wouldn't be a loud, messy explosion. It would be a quiet, systematic, and utterly humiliating dismantling, carried out by the very establishment he so desperately wanted to impress. It was, in its own way, a work of art. The aftermath was exactly as I had pictured it, a slow, quiet, ruinous corrosion. There was no dramatic headline in the papers the next day. Museums of that caliber do not air their dirty laundry in public. Instead, a short press release was issued a week later, stating that the Morrow exhibit has been concluded ahead of schedule to allow for further scholarly review and technical analysis. In the art world, that kind of language is a death sentence. It's the polite academic equivalent of a skull and crossbones. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the closed circles of collectors, curators, and auction houses. Arthur Morrow, the man of taste, was suddenly toxic. Dr. Finch was as thorough as I knew she would be. She brought in her own teams. They confirmed everything my little USB drive had told them. Not just the Bronzino, but the entire collection was a sham, a gallery of ghosts. Arthur was forced to buy back the collection from the museum's trust, a legal maneuver to avoid a public lawsuit, but the cost was astronomical. He had leveraged millions against the fraudulent value of his paintings, and now, the banks came calling. His house of cards, built on lies and my mother's stolen legacy, collapsed in on itself. He had to sell the mansion. The climate-controlled gallery was emptied, its contents now worthless, relegated to the status of curious props. He and Philippa moved into a small, sterile apartment, the kind of place they would have sneered at a year before. His social circle evaporated. No one returned his calls. In the world he cared about, he had ceased to exist. And me, I am here, in my studio. It's bigger now. I bought the adjacent space with the profits from a few very successful high-profile restoration projects. My reputation, far from being ruined, was quietly enhanced. The right people heard the story, the real story, and they knew I was a restorer who valued truth above all else. In the center of my new studio, on a table where the light from the window falls just so, is a stack of old leather-bound books, my mother's journals. I spend my evenings with them, with her. I'm finally getting to know her, not as the sainted tragic figure Arthur had painted, but as a real woman, witty, intelligent, and in the early days, deeply in love with a man who would ultimately betray her. It's a bittersweet kind of peace. You know, for the longest time, I thought this was a story about revenge. And on some level, maybe it was. It would be a lie to say I didn't feel a grim satisfaction watching Arthur's world implode under the weight of his own arrogance. He built a kingdom of fakes, and his punishment was to become a fake himself, a man with the trappings of wealth but none of the substance. But sitting here now, with my mother's words in front of me, and the smell of real linseed oil in the air, I realize it was about something more. It was about restoration, not of a painting, but of myself. Arthur had spent 2 decades defining my value, assigning me the role of the overlooked, unimportant supporting character in his grand drama. The discovery of that signature didn't give me power. It simply made me realize the power I'd had all along. My knowledge, my skill, my delicate pastime, that was the one real thing in his house of forgeries. He built his identity on things he could buy. I built mine on what I could do, what I could understand, what I could save. True value isn't something you can hang on a wall or lock in a vault. It's the quiet, steady truth of who you are. He never understood that. His pride was a fragile thing, brittle as old varnish, and it shattered at the slightest touch of reality. All I did was hold up a mirror and let him see the truth. Thank you for listening to my story. I know so many of us have felt overlooked or undervalued by the people who are supposed to see us most clearly. It's a painful and isolating experience. If you've ever been through something similar, if you've ever had to fight to define your own worth against someone else's narrative, I hope you'll share your story in the comments below. It's important for us to know we're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more content. You never know what truths are waiting to be uncovered.